Oh boy.
When I wake up each day, I feel so weary. Try to face the world, but it's so dreary. But I found that special thing that makes me cheery. Time to do music theory. Music theory.
Okay, so welcome to video number 2. Let's do some actual theory work now. And what I hope you've done already is gone to the Canvas page and look at or print out the Recovered Memories worksheet. It's in a module. If you click on modules, there's a module called January 11, and you'll see all the work we're going to do for the first day of class in that module, including the Recovered Memories worksheet. So before you go through this video, you want to have gone through that worksheet and tried to write down the answers on it for yourself about what you think happens. And what this is basically going to be is this is going to be a tutorial where we go through and talk about what the answers are. So let's just have at it. The first question says, the most usual role for a 5 chord to perform is what? So we got to think about what 5 chords do. And of course, you know, hopefully everybody knows when we talk about 5 chords, we're talking about the chord built on the 5th note of the scale. That one. And what does a 5 chord do most often? They like to sound like that a lot. There's a 5 chord at the beginning of that measure, and then there's some other chord at the ending of the measure, and that's sort of showing us that the thing a 5 chord likes to do most is it likes to lead to the tonic. 5 leading to 1 is one of the strongest ways that tonality is established. So your first question, you know, the answer is the most usual role for a 5 chord is to lead to tonic. And the second question is sort of a variation on that. One thing that a 5 chord does real well is lead to tonic, but there's another chord that's also really good at doing it. In fact, there's a picture of that other chord that does it. Remember, this is what 5 going to tonic sounds like. And this is what that particular example there that's on the screen in front of you now sounds like. It also led to tonic rather nicely. Here's 5 going to tonic. 5, 1. And here's what's on that diagram right now. And of course, that chord that's leading to 1 so nicely is a leading tone triad, a 7 diminished chord. Just like 5 can draw us real strongly to 1, so can that diminished 7 chord. And it's because both a 5 chord and a diminished 7 chord have the leading tone in them, which pulls so strongly to the tonic. Here's a nice fill in the blank. If a 5 chord does not fulfill its usual role, that is, does not go to a tonic chord, it will probably blank blank by going to the following chord. So it's a 2-word answer I'm looking for. And there's a little musical diagram to illustrate it. We're going to stay in D major still, and there's our 5 chord. But instead of going to 1, like we've been hearing, that 5 chord does something different. That 5 chord does this. It didn't go to 1, it went to 6, like we see in a deceptive cadence. And when a 5 goes to a 6, we say it's resolving deceptively. So that's the answer I'm looking for. If a 5 doesn't go to 1, it will probably resolve deceptively by going to 6. Here's one of those weirdly, annoyingly worded questions. I consider 5/7 my best friend tonally because. Why do I consider this chord such a useful chord? It's a 5/7 chord. And it's one of those chords that can do something kind of no other chord can do. Notice how whenever you hear a 5/7 chord, you already start thinking about what the next chord's going to be, even if you haven't heard it yet. When I play this, it primes me to expect this. Or to put it in another key, just to prove this works, you know, if I play this, then even though I haven't heard that other chord yet, I know the other chord I might want to expect next is I might want to hear this chord go to this. Both of those would be considered 5/7 chords that went to 1 chords. And the reason why I would say 5/7 is such a good friend tonally is because it's a major minor 7th chord. And for the way classical and romantic and Baroque composers thought about tonality and thought about chord quality, pretty much the only time they ever wrote a major minor 7th chord was on the 5th scale degree, the dominant, which is why some people call major minor 7th chords dominant 7th chords. Because it only tends to be used on the 5th scale degree, it's hard to hear a major minor 7th chord and not think you're hearing a 5/7 chord. So if I play this, it's a major minor 7th chord that makes me think it's going to do this next. It's hard not to imagine that chord going straight to its tonic. Major minor 7th chords are almost always 5/7 chords. So they're really good at letting us know what the tonic is, orienting us into the right key. A couple reasons for why that may happen. One is that a major minor 7th chord has the leading tone of the scale in it. And when you hear that note, you know you want it to resolve up to the tonic. The other thing too is a major minor 7th chord is dissonant. It has the 7th of the chord in it, which also has somewhere it wants to go. Just like the leading tone wants to go up to the tonic, that 7th wants to move down a step. So, you know, that major minor 7th chord quality that we find in 5/7 is really good because it so strongly suggests tonic. Okay, next question. The vast majority of the time, a fully diminished 7th chord functions as this. And there's a picture of it. There's an inverted fully diminished 7th chord, but here's what it sounds like. And you can already probably sense that it would like to go there. And most times when a fully diminished 7th chord shows up, we hear it as a leading tone fully diminished 7th chord, a 7 fully diminished 7 chord, and it wants to resolve to the tonic. That's what it tends to do most of the time. I'm sure we'll talk about the exceptions to the rule later on down the road here, but for now, that's the most useful thing to know is if it's a fully diminished 7th chord, it tends to act like a 7 diminished 7 and pull towards tonic. Pulling towards tonic is a big deal in tonal music. That's how we know where we are. And on that note, let's talk about the chords that can make the one chord sound like the tonic, or that can tonicize, because there are 5 different types of chords that can do it. And there they all are. The first one, and the one that does it the best, I would argue, is the major minor 7th chord, which sounds like 5/7. Goes to 1. But you know, other chords besides major minor 7th chords can do it. You can use just a major triad, which sounds like a 5 chord that goes to a 1 chord. And of course, the other chords that do it well are the various chords that have diminished triads as their basis. The fully diminished triad, the fully diminished 7th chord, Yes, I know I said fully diminished triad a second ago, by the way. That's wrong. It's just diminished triad. But this is a fully diminished seventh chord that pulls toward a chord that sounds like tonic. And the other type of chord that has a diminished triad in it that does this is the diminished minor seventh chord, or the half diminished seventh chord. Those are 5 types of chords that tonicize well. Although here's one of the most useful things I'm going to tell y'all in this class. After having just said there can be a 7 diminished triad, or a 7 fully diminished 7 chord, or a 7 half diminished 7 chord, and that's all true, by the way. The other thing that you should know is this. Most times when we see a half diminished 7th chord show up, the composer doesn't like to use it as a leading tone 7 chord. He or she doesn't like to write it as 7 half diminished 7. Instead, the favored way to use half diminished 7th chords is like we see happening in this passage right here, which I hope I can read. It's very small on my screen, but it sounds like this. Here it is again. That makes perfect musical sense, by the way, doesn't it? And one of those chords is a half diminished 7 chord, and it's the one right in the middle, the one with the C and the G and the A and the E flat in it. It would be an A half diminished 7 chord in first inversion. And the way it functions, it's not 7 half diminished 7 of anything. It's 2 half diminished 7, actually 2 half diminished 6/5. And the way composers tend to use half diminished 7th chords most often is as 2 chords going to 5 chords. Because 2 chords are predominants. So a lot of times when we hear a half diminished 7th chord, we're hearing it as a predominant 2 half diminished 7 chord that then leads to the 5 chord. That's what being predominant means. You come before the dominant. And of course then the 5 goes to the 1, like that. Now, about the 5 chord, the dominant. Here are a few ways to soup up a 5 chord to make it have a little bit more zing. And really, you know, there's a way to look at music theory and harmony and say that the story of the 19th century is basically the story of composers finding different ways to soup up the 5 chord. Because when the 5 chord's just a triad, look, we're in a new key, by the way. We're in E now. And when the 5 chord's just a triad, that's fine, and it still leads to 1. But there are things you can do to make that 5 chord that's just a triad seem a little bit more strong. One thing that we learn early on is you can add a 7th to that 5 chord. Wow, and already it sounds a lot more insistent that it's going to lead to a 1 chord there, because it's got that 7th, which makes it dissonant. Well, throughout the 1800s, composers try to find ways to make their 5 chords more dissonant. So one thing they might do is what we see happening on the 3rd set of 8th notes there. They take that 5 chord and raise the 5th and make it into an augmented dominant with a 7th on it. So notice how dissonant that chord is. It's got a lot of notes in it that want to resolve. And the other thing composers do is what we see happening in the very, very last thing there. Sometimes they get rid of the 5th in their chord entirely, and they put a 6th instead. Instead of that chord being B, D sharp, F sharp, A, I get rid of the F sharp, which is the 5th, and I add a 6th above the root instead. So B, D sharp, G sharp, and A. And listen to how dissonant that chord is. So there are all sorts of different things happening with a 5 chord, being just a triad, being a major minor 7th chord, being an augmented 7th chord, or being a 5/7 sub 6 chord. All ways to make that dominant chord seem even more unstable and dissonant and lead to the tonic all the more. And enough talk about dominance. Let's talk about predominance now. A predominant is a chord that leads to dominant harmony, which means it usually leads to a 5 chord or to a 1/6/4 chord that's going to go straight to a 5 chord. And the most common predominant chords are the 2 chord and the 4 chord. And it doesn't matter whether they're minor or major or diminished. Roman numeral 2 and Roman numeral 4 are the strongest normal predominants we have. But just like composers tend to play around with their dominant chords and make them sound more tense and pull to the 1 chord more, they also tend to play around with their predominant chords and do that. So here in the key of C minor, we've got a whole bunch of different predominant chords that can happen. The first one's just a secondary dominant. If you're in the key of C minor, then one thing that'll really strengthen the approach to the 5 chord is if you come at it with a 5/5 chord, like that. And of course then 5 leads to 1. But the other chord that's really good at doing this is the 7 diminished. This is of 5. Anything of 5 is a predominant. So 5/7 of 5 is a good one, as would 5/5 be. 7 fully diminished 7 of 5 is a good predominant. But it could also be 7 diminished as a triad of 5 or 7 half diminished 7 of 5, and it would still work. Other chords that are good predominants in C minor, that chord in the middle, which is a D flat major chord, a major chord built on the flat 2nd scale degree, what we would call a Neapolitan chord, and our buddies the augmented 6th chord, the Italian augmented 6th chord, the French augmented 6th chord, and the German augmented 6th chord. Going to 1/6/4, and then the 5/7, and then 1. So those are some of the chromatic predominants you might experience. And here's another thing that I can't emphasize the importance of enough, although y'all are certainly going to feel like I do this from time to time. Let's talk about second inversion triads, so-called 6/4 chords. I think they're really useful. I tend to think they're some of the best things we have when we're analyzing music. And there are a few reasons why I think that. Let me tell y'all what those reasons are. This is a passage with a cadential 6/4 chord. It's the most common 6/4 chord we find in classical musical styles. And when we have that 6/4 chord that's a cadential 6/4 chord, what happens is it tends to lead to a 5 chord or a 5/7 chord in root position. So if I'm in the key of A, then when I hear that cadential 6/4 chord, right there, it's probably going to lead to a 5 chord, which is then in turn going to do what 5 chords do, lead to a 1 chord. Here it is again without me narrating. And notice that 6/4 chord, it doesn't feel stable. It feels like it wants to go somewhere. That somewhere being the 5 chord, which then wants to in turn go to the 1 chord. Another type of 6/4 chord that we see a lot is the one we call the passing 6/4 chord. We call it that because of the way the bass part looks. In passing 6/4 chords, the bass part tends to go up in steps, like this one does. And the passing 6/4 chord's the one in the middle. That B that's the bass note gets between the A and the C sharp, like a passing tone. And when we hear that passing 6/4 progression, it sounds like this. And for some reason, I'm ending on a 2 chord. There, let's have a proper cadence. But listen to that passing 6/4 chord again. You can hear it in the bass line, and they can go like this one. They can go up, or they can go in reverse. The bass line can go down. Either way, it works. But that stepwise bass line is one of the giveaways of it. The other thing is that usually while the bass is doing what it does, there's some part that does the opposite. Like if you look here at the bass, you'll see the bass is going A, B, C sharp. While it does that, look at the alto. It does the exact same thing in reverse. Goes C sharp, B, A. You'll see that in most of the passing 6/4 chords out there, that type of contrary motion where one voice does the bass line in reverse. It's what they call a voice exchange. And it makes that nice little full sounding progression when you put in the inner voices with it. And let's talk about the final 6/4 chord type that we need to be concerned with. The so-called neighbor 6/4 chord or pedal 6/4 chord. Call it a pedal 6/4 chord because when you hear it, the bass line usually doesn't move. It stays on the same pitch throughout. Like happening here. Notice how the bass just stays on A like a pedal tone. People who call it a neighbor 6/4 chord are probably noticing what's happening in the treble clef with that E, F sharp, E, and that C sharp, D, C sharp, where they act like neighbor tones, but the bass part acts like pedal tones. So that's what a pedal or a neighbor 6/4 chord is, or an auxiliary 6/4 chord if you like British terminology. And of course the 1/6/4 chord I'm leaving out is the one we call the arpeggiated 6/4 chord. It's the one you hear when you hear bass lines that do stuff like this. I'm just going back and forth between 1, 1/6/4, 1, 1/6/4. It's probably the most common 6/4 chord on the planet because of how often they like to use it in country songs. But classical composers hardly ever use it, so it's not really going to show up in anything we look at. So the ones I want you to be accountable for are cadential, passing, and neighbor 6/4 chords. And on that note, I think we're done with part 1 of the Recovered Memories worksheet, which covers harmony things. Let's go in our next video to part 2 of the Recovered Memories worksheet, which is all about form and analysis. So I will see y'all on video number 3, which is Recovered Memories worksheet part 2. Enjoy.